This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth, buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
On Valentine's Day, a holiday wrapped in flowers and tender promises, tragedy erupted in a Florida home. It was supposed to be a day of affection, a day to celebrate love. Instead, it became the stage for a horror that no neighbor, no friend, and no child could ever forget. At the center of this story was Anthony Price, a man whose life, reputation, and secrets collided with devastating force. He was a father in his late 40s, a husband, and a well-regarded member of his community. To those who knew him casually, he was respectable and steady. To those who loved him, he was complicated, a man with flaws but also with moments of undeniable charm. He worked hard, carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, and spoke often about family loyalty. Yet, beneath the surface of that polished exterior, cracks had already begun to form. The Florida sun had set that evening in a blaze of pink and orange, leaving behind a sky that seemed calm, almost romantic. A warm breeze carried the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden, and the faint sound of laughter drifted from homes where couples shared dinner and exchanged gifts. In the Price household, however, the air was heavy with suspicion. Valentine's Day had been fractured before it began. Words had been exchanged earlier in the week, sharp ones, unspoken accusations hanging in the room long after silence fell. For Valeria, Anthony's wife and a police officer sworn to uphold the law, doubt had taken root. She could no longer ignore the late-night absences, the secretive behavior, the uneasy silence that grew between them. She had chosen, on this very night, to confront what she feared. The house carried the smell of dinner long gone cold. A single candle flickered on the table, but it had burned past its moment of beauty and stood lopsided in melted wax. In the bedroom, clothes were strewn across the floor, as if carelessly discarded. The sound that followed was not laughter or joy but something far darker, a gasp of betrayal, a cry of disbelief. It was the moment she opened a door and saw a scene no human being should ever have to see, her husband with their 13-year-old son. It was not simply an act of betrayal. It was the shattering of every boundary, every promise of protection, every definition of family. Time seemed to stop, and yet in the same instant, everything moved too quickly. Anthony scrambled, shock flashing across his face, but the image had already burned itself into Valeria's mind. She had walked into a nightmare that could not be undone. The silence of the neighborhood outside stood in cruel contrast to the chaos inside the home. A television played faintly in the living room, broadcasting a cheerful commercial about love, while in the bedroom, a life was about to unravel in violence. Valeria, the officer who had been trained to confront criminals, now faced the man she once trusted with her life. The man who had vowed fidelity and protection had crossed into something unspeakable. In that split second, she was no longer just a wife or a mother. She became a witness, a protector, and ultimately, an executioner. The sound that followed was unmistakable, the eruption of gunfire, again and again, echoing against the walls of their home. 17 shots in total, each one ringing like a final judgment. The smell of gunpowder filled the room, acrid and sharp, mixing with the faint perfume of the extinguished candle. Neighbors would later recall hearing a volley of shots, too many to count, followed by a silence so deep it felt suffocating. When it was over, Anthony Price lay lifeless on the bedroom floor. His body, riddled with bullets, was a grim reflection of everything that had collapsed in those final moments. A man who had once been seen as a pillar of strength now lay broken by the very person sworn to defend the vulnerable. Valeria stood frozen, her weapon still warm in her hand, her world forever changed. And so, Valentine's Day in that quiet Florida neighborhood turned into a night of horror. Sirens would soon pierce the air, blue and red lights flashing against manicured lawns and pastel-painted houses. But before the first responders arrived, before the crime tape cordoned off the home, before investigators began piecing together the shattered fragments of a family, one haunting question remained. What leads a wife and police officer to shoot her husband 17 times on a night meant for love? Before the horror that unfolded on Valentine's Day, the Price family presented themselves as a portrait of stability. To neighbors and acquaintances, their home was a place of order and warmth. A modest, well-kept house sat at the end of a quiet Florida street, its front lawn neatly trimmed, the porch light always shining in the evening. To passers-by, it looked like a place where family dinners were shared, where laughter could spill through open windows on summer nights, and where the future seemed secure. Inside, the rhythms of daily life followed familiar patterns. Anthony was the man of the house, working steadily and appearing to provide the kind of constancy expected of a father. He had a reputation for being dependable, even if aloof at times. He was the kind of neighbor who waved politely while mowing the lawn, but rarely lingered long in conversation. At home, however, his presence carried both comfort and weight. To his wife Valeria, he was a partner she had once admired for his strength and ambition. To his son, he was a figure of authority, someone who commanded respect but who could also inspire unease. Valeria herself embodied strength in another form. As a police officer, she was accustomed to discipline, to responding to crisis with composure. She carried herself with quiet pride, her uniform a symbol of her commitment to law and community. To friends, she was someone reliable, a woman who balanced the demands of her career with the responsibilities of motherhood. Yet, beneath her calm surface, doubts had been stirring. The bond between her and Anthony had grown strained. Arguments that once blew over quickly began to linger, their edges sharper, their echoes lasting longer. Still, the illusion of safety held. The Prices were not a family that drew suspicion or gossip. They attended community gatherings, joined neighborhood barbecues, and carried on with the routines that signaled normal life. Holidays were celebrated with modest festivity. Birthdays were remembered. Photographs lined the hallway, showing smiling faces, vacations, and moments of apparent joy. To an outsider, there was nothing unusual here. Only the semblance of an ordinary American family. But within this safe illusion, the first cracks had already formed. There were late nights when Anthony's explanations seemed too thin, when his absences raised quiet questions. There were shifts in mood, sudden anger, unexplained silence, that left Valeria unsettled. She tried, at first, to dismiss these feelings as stress, as the natural strain of marriage and work. Yet a part of her knew that something was slipping, that the foundation beneath them was less secure than it seemed. Friends who visited the household noticed subtle things. A tension in the air during dinners. A glance exchanged between husband and wife that carried more weight than words. A forced smile in a family photo. To most, these were details easy to overlook, the ordinary friction of family life. But in retrospect, they were fragments of a story that was moving steadily toward collapse. For their son, life carried on in the shadow of these changes. At 13, he stood on the cusp of adolescence, a boy caught between childhood innocence and the weight of adult realities. His world was shaped by school, by friendships, by the confusing signals he received from home. To him, his father's authority and his mother's discipline were constants, though not always comforting ones. In a household that seemed secure from the outside, he was living in an environment where boundaries were blurring, and danger was closer than anyone dared to admit. The neighborhood itself reinforced the illusion. Families lived side by side in pastel houses, children played in cul-de-sacs, and couples walked dogs along the sidewalks. Crime was something that happened elsewhere, in distant cities, not in their quiet corner of Florida. The idea that such violence could erupt in their midst seemed unthinkable. That is why, when the truth finally broke through, the shock was so profound. The community had believed in the mask of normalcy. The family had upheld it. And Valeria herself, despite her instincts, had clung to it, until the night she could no longer deny what lay beneath. The collapse of a family never happens all at once. It begins quietly, in small gestures and subtle shifts, the kind most people ignore until it is too late. In the Price household, the first cracks were already widening, though on the surface everything seemed unchanged. Anthony had always been a man who valued control, but in the months leading up to Valentine's Day, his behavior grew erratic. His work hours stretched later, his explanations grew thinner, and he spent more time locked away in his own world. He guarded his phone closely, turning it face down on the table, stepping outside to take calls, leaving vague reasons for his absences. To Valeria, each excuse carried the faint weight of dishonesty. She had heard them before, but this time they felt different, practiced, almost rehearsed. One evening, she noticed something out of place, a cryptic message flashing across his screen. It was not a name she recognized, not a casual remark, but something that struck her as strange. When she asked, he brushed it off, irritation cutting through his voice. Arguments followed, sharp words spilling into long silences that thickened the air of the house. Where once there had been trust, now there was distance. Their son, too, began to change. At school, teachers noted he was distracted, restless, less engaged in class. At home, he withdrew, spending more time alone in his room. He seemed uneasy in his father's presence, shifting uncomfortably when Anthony entered the room, speaking less freely, his laughter fading. To an observer, it might have looked like the ordinary turbulence of adolescence. But to Valeria, trained to notice shifts in behavior, it signaled something deeper. Friends and neighbors began to sense tension as well. During a holiday gathering, one recalled how Anthony's smile looked strained, his arm around Valeria more for appearance than affection. Another remembered how Valeria seemed unusually quiet, her gaze distant, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. These details did not yet alarm anyone. They were simply fragments of a story no one had pieced together. The strain on the marriage grew more pronounced with each passing week. Financial disagreements surfaced, unexplained withdrawals from accounts, purchases that didn't match their usual spending. Valeria confronted him, but the answers she received were evasive. He insisted it was nothing, that she was imagining problems, that stress from her job was clouding her judgment. Yet the more he deflected, the more her instincts told her something was wrong. There were moments when the unease turned into fear. Late one night, she returned from a shift to find Anthony awake, sitting alone in the darkened living room. The television flickered with muted images, but he wasn't watching. His expression was distant, unreadable. When she asked if something was wrong, he replied too quickly, his tone sharp, as if her question itself were an intrusion. For Valeria, the weight of suspicion became unbearable. She began watching more closely, piecing together the fragments. The missed dinners. The secretive phone calls. The tension in her son's demeanor. She could not yet see the full truth, but she felt it pressing against her, demanding to be uncovered. The community around them still believed in their illusion of normalcy. To neighbors, they were just another family weathering the ups and downs of life. To co-workers, Valeria was the steady officer who rarely spoke about her private struggles. No one knew how fragile their world had become, how close the Prices were to breaking. By the time Valentine's Day arrived, the cracks had widened into fractures. Beneath the surface of their home, the threads that held them together had already begun to unravel. What remained was a silence heavy with unspoken truths, and a storm waiting to break. Valentine's Day arrived cloaked in the same symbols of love that had marked countless years before it. Stores were filled with roses and chocolates, cards exchanged between couples, and restaurants booked with reservations. But in the Price household, the day was heavy with tension. What should have been a celebration of intimacy was instead marked by silence and unease. In the morning, Anthony moved through the house with a sense of detachment. He offered little more than brief words, his presence distant, his attention fixed on his phone. Valeria noticed, her instincts sharpening with each glance. The unease that had lingered for weeks now pressed in with full force. She had debated confronting him, debated exposing what she already suspected. But a gnawing sense told her the truth would reveal itself, and soon. Throughout the day, Valeria carried the weight of her dual roles, a mother watching her son grow increasingly uneasy and an officer bound by duty to protect the innocent. Her heart told her something was not right. Her mind urged her to wait, to watch, to gather proof. Yet beneath it all was a storm of emotion she could no longer contain. As night fell, the neighborhood glowed with porch lights and the faint laughter of families celebrating the holiday. Inside the Price home, shadows stretched across the walls, broken only by the flicker of a candle that burned on the dining table. Dinner had been prepared, but it went untouched, the silence of the evening thicker than any words. At some point, Valeria left the table and moved through the house. Each step carried her closer to the truth she had feared. The bedroom door, slightly ajar, revealed the scene that shattered everything. Anthony was not alone. He was with their 13-year-old son, caught in the act of betrayal so profound it defied words. The moment burned itself into her memory, her husband's face twisted in shock, the boy's innocence stolen in an instant, the silence in the room screaming louder than any words could. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the candle's faint scent of wax and smoke mixed with the stench of betrayal. For Valeria, time collapsed into a single heartbeat. The vows of marriage, the trust of family, the duty of a mother, all of it broke apart in that instant. She reached for the one object that symbolized both her authority and her protection, her service weapon. Anthony scrambled, his expression shifting from guilt to desperation. But the weight of his actions had already sealed his fate. The first shot rang out like thunder, shattering the fragile silence of the home. Then another. And another. A volley of gunfire echoed through the walls, 17 rounds in total, each one a burst of rage, grief, and judgment. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and choking. The candle on the table flickered violently before snuffing out, as if extinguished by the violence itself. Neighbors later said the shots came in such rapid succession that they could hardly count them, only the rhythm of chaos pounding into the night. When the final shot was fired, Anthony Price lay lifeless on the floor. His body bore the weight of his wife's fury, his secrets laid bare in death. The home that had once stood as a symbol of family now reeked of tragedy. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, broken only by the faint hum of the television still playing in another room. Valeria stood over him, weapon still in her hand, her breath ragged. She was no longer the officer sworn to uphold the law. She was a mother who had witnessed the ultimate betrayal, a wife whose trust had been desecrated, and a woman who had reached her breaking point. The very principles that had guided her life were now blurred by the stark reality of what she had seen. Her son remained frozen, caught between shock and terror. The scene before him was one no child should ever endure, the death of his father at the hands of his mother, the collapse of his world in the span of seconds. Outside, the neighborhood remained unaware of the devastation within those walls. Couples exchanged gifts, children slept in their beds, and the illusion of safety carried on. But inside, the breaking point had arrived with violent finality. Sirens soon pierced the night, their wails cutting through the quiet streets. Blue and red lights washed over the pastel houses, flashing across manicured lawns and hedges. Officers arrived to a scene that left them stunned, a fellow cop standing over her husband's body, her weapon discharged, her face hollow with shock. The breaking point had come and gone. What remained was devastation, and a question that would haunt the community, the investigators, and the nation: what could drive a woman, a mother, and a protector to unleash 17 rounds of fury into the man she once loved? When the gunfire ceased and silence reclaimed the Price household, the outside world still remained unaware. It was not until the first call reached dispatch that the wider community began to stir. Neighbors who had heard the shots described the sound as rapid, relentless, unlike anything they had ever heard in their quiet suburban street. At first, some assumed it might have been fireworks, an unusual choice for Valentine's Day, but as the seconds stretched into minutes, unease grew. The arrival of patrol cars shattered the illusion of normalcy. Sirens cut through the night, and flashing red and blue lights illuminated the neighborhood. Families peeked through curtains, their faces pale with fear and curiosity. Officers entered the home with caution, their training preparing them for chaos but not for what awaited them inside. There, they found Valeria, her uniform disheveled, her weapon lying on the floor. Her expression was vacant, as if the weight of her actions had hollowed her out. Anthony's body lay still, riddled with bullets, the room thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Their son was frozen in shock, caught in the impossible position of witnessing both the crime and its aftermath. The scene struck even the most seasoned officers with disbelief. Word of the shooting spread quickly. A police officer had killed her husband, not in the line of duty, not in defense of her own life, but in a moment of uncontainable fury and betrayal. The fact that the act had taken place on Valentine's Day, a day meant to honor love, made the story all the more haunting. The community was shaken to its core. Vigils were held in the days that followed, candles flickering in memory of a life lost and in recognition of a family destroyed. Neighbors who had once exchanged polite greetings with the Prices now stood in clusters, their conversations marked by disbelief. How could something so violent happen here? How could someone sworn to uphold the law unleash such destruction inside her own home? Early investigations left room for questions. Some believed the act was driven solely by rage, others whispered about years of secrets finally coming to light. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood, cameras capturing every detail, every face of grief and speculation. Headlines carried the story across the state and beyond, framing it as a tale of betrayal, of family, of violence too close to home. Friends and fellow officers found themselves torn between shock and sorrow. Valeria had been one of their own, a colleague they had trusted, now under suspicion for a crime that defied comprehension. Some defended her as a woman who had simply reached her breaking point. Others struggled to reconcile her actions with the oath she had sworn. As detectives pieced together the evidence, the story only grew darker. The community's grief transformed into anger, then into questions of accountability. This was no ordinary crime. It was a rupture of trust, a betrayal of family, and a scandal that would forever stain the memory of that quiet Florida neighborhood. In the days following the shooting, investigators began piecing together the fragments of a story that seemed almost too heavy to bear. The first task was to separate fact from speculation. Neighbors and reporters had already filled the silence with theories, but the truth would emerge only through evidence, testimony, and time. Forensics teams combed through the Price home with precision. Spent shell casings lay scattered across the floor, each one marking a moment of fury. The trajectory of the bullets confirmed what the neighbors had already heard, a barrage of 17 shots fired in rapid succession. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, no intruder to blame. The conclusion was unavoidable: this had been an act carried out within the family, not against it. Attention turned to Valeria. In interviews, her composure wavered between numbness and grief. She spoke haltingly, her words carrying the weight of someone caught between her identity as a law enforcement officer and her reality as a woman whose life had imploded. Investigators pressed her for motive, for clarity, for a reason that could make sense of what had happened. The pieces they uncovered painted a picture more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Testimonies revealed the tension in the marriage. Friends recounted arguments that had grown sharper over the past year. Co-workers noticed her distraction on the job. Neighbors recalled her son's withdrawn demeanor, the way he seemed uneasy in his father's presence. Slowly, the fragments formed a narrative, one of betrayal, of boundaries crossed, and of a mother pushed beyond her limits. The pivotal moment came when the child himself, under careful and protective questioning, confirmed what Valeria had walked in on that night. It was the revelation that silenced even the most skeptical voices. Anthony Price had not only betrayed his marriage but had violated the trust of his own son. For Valeria, who had sworn to protect others from such acts in her professional life, the discovery was intolerable. Her response, though violent and irreversible, was framed by investigators as the breaking point of a woman who could not reconcile law, love, and betrayal in the same breath. Court proceedings drew intense attention. Prosecutors laid out the facts with unflinching clarity: 17 rounds fired, a husband dead, a home destroyed. The defense leaned heavily on the emotional storm that consumed Valeria in that moment, portraying her less as a cold killer and more as a mother pushed into madness by what she had seen. Her uniform became a symbol of contradiction, both the oath she had broken and the authority she once embodied. In the end, the verdict carried both justice and tragedy. Valeria was found guilty, the court acknowledging her crime while the community struggled to reconcile it with the horror that had driven her there. The sentence ensured she would spend years behind bars, her life forever divided into before and after that Valentine's Day. For those who knew the family, the truth was devastating. It was not just the loss of a man or the imprisonment of a woman. It was the destruction of a household, the shattering of a child's world, and the lingering stain on a community that had believed such darkness could never reach them. The story of the Price family is more than a crime scene frozen in time. It is a haunting reminder of how quickly trust can collapse, how betrayal can ripple through every corner of a home, and how the people we depend on most can become the ones who break us. Valentine's Day, a holiday meant to symbolize devotion, became instead a marker of devastation. Anthony's death, Valeria's imprisonment, and their son's shattered innocence stand as an unshakable testament to the weight of hidden secrets. Behind closed doors, danger can fester unnoticed until it erupts in violence that no one can undo. We remember not only the tragedy but also the warning, that silence protects no one, and vigilance is often the only shield against betrayal. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below, subscribe for more true crime investigations, and help keep these difficult conversations alive.